Hi folks, this video deals with a fuel additive that's intended to stabilize fuel for, let's say, when you're storing your engine for an extended period of time. Back in 2020 and 2021, a series of YouTube videos were made by an individual who uses the title Taryl Fixes All. His videos are quite entertaining. He gives a lot of good information about small engine repair. And in a couple of his video series, he does a test on a number of the more popular fuel additives or fuel stabilizers. I believe I'm fair in stating his conclusion at the end of his test that he considers these products not effective. His test included using a number of identical engines in which each engine was filled with a fuel treated with a different additive. On an interval of about 30 days, he would go out and attempt to start the engine. At least one of these tests went for a period of about 18 months. As time passed, more and more the engines would fail, and when he would then open up the carburetor and take a look to see what the situation was, and usually the reason for the startup, well, in every case, the reason for the startup appeared to be a sludge collecting in the carburetor. Well, included in the products that he tested was a product called StaBil 360. Taryl's conclusions kind of stepped on my toes since I'd been using a sister product to the StaBil 360. This is the StaBil Storage, and I thought it was a pretty good product. So I decided to perhaps to trust but to verify, and I wanted to set up a little test of my own with the StaBil product that I've been using. Right now I'm sitting outside of an unheated shed where I set my little experiment up. Let's go inside and take a look at the test bank that I set up. Okay, before you see 5, these are mason jars, canning jars, commonly used for putting food stock up and canning it. And in each of the jars were equipped with a lid that has a gasket around the lid. And in each of these I added 12 ounces of a fluid, the fluid being gasoline, of course. Now I'll describe the condition of each of these. Now this test was initially set up on April 23rd of 2022. That's when the fuel was installed in the jars. And this particular jar contains untreated ethanol containing fuel. This is just a standard, I believe it's 85 octane, just out of the pump. And when it was filled, you can see a mark here that I made indicating a fill line on the jar back a year ago. The second jar contains the same type of fuel, except in this case I added the StaBil Extend stabilizer to the fuel. And again, this had a piece of tape on it that indicated level at the starting of the test. Then this particular jar, oh, I forgot to mention also that these two jars, 1 and 2, have a small hole drilled in the top of the jar. Just took a 3/32 inch diameter bit and drilled a hole in it. So this jar and this jar is ventilated. However, this jar contains the same fuel, and it's not treated in any way, and the lid was left intact. No hole was drilled in it, so it's not ventilated. And here is a mark indicating approximately the original level. It has dropped a little bit, but nothing like the level drop in the two jars here that had contained the ethanol-based or ethanol-included fuels. Finally, this jar number 4, contains a product that is purported to have no ethanol in it. It's sold as pure fuel, and again, this jar does have, it is vented at the top, and you can see here where the level was at originally. It has gone down. It's approaching 50% loss on this one, but not quite as much loss as with the fuels that contained ethanol. And finally, the 5th jar contains true fuel, but again, the lid on this particular jar was not penetrated, so this was unvented, and as you can see, there's perhaps a slight drop in the liquid level from the line that was put on there a year ago, but almost the same level, almost no loss of gas product out of this container. Now, again, these weren't started at exactly the same time. This one was is dated 4/23 of 22. These two. This jar was put in place at 4/25 in 22, a couple of days later, and then the true fuel was added to the collection of jars here in May 9th of 2022. 3 or 4 weeks later. But in the total picture here, there is practically the same time, but it wasn't started on the identical same day. Also, in each jar, I put if I can hold it here where you may be able to see it, small square of metal. This is just a piece of steel that was had a little bit of rust on it. It's unfinished steel, not galvanized or protected from corrosion in any way. And I put this each piece of this steel on my on a wire wheel and removed the rust, and I put it in here. So far, again, I doubt that it's visible here, but none of these pieces of steel are at this point are showing any signs of rust or corrosion. So in approximately a year, as I've said before, we saw a considerable amount of evaporation out of the ethanol jars containing ethanol that were vented. In jar 4 that has the true fuel, it's also vented, but it seemed to have experienced less evaporative loss than with the ethanol-based fuels. I have no idea what the difference is. Something about the tendency of the two types of fuel to evaporate. Now, all 3 of these jars, 1 and 2 and 4, were all vented. Also, jar 3 contains fuel again with ethanol in it, and we experienced some evaporation and perhaps a little less evaporation than out of the jar 5, which contained the true fuel. I'm not sure. Neither of these jars were vented, but at the same time they weren't sealed very tightly either. They had just a loose fitting gasket at the top, and I didn't try to seal them down. This may be an indication of additional leakage or additional evaporation from ethanol fuel as compared to non-ethanol containing fuels, or it may just be a difference in the seal. But anyway, as you can see, there is a little more evaporation out of the jar that was theoretically sealed and contained ethanol containing fuel. I did not observe any formation of sludge in the bottom of the vented jars or phase separation that occurs when water collects within the fuel samples and causes the phase separation between the ethanol and the gasoline or the basic solution of the gasoline. Water has an affinity for alcohol, and if you have any water in your tank, the water will tend to absorb the alcohol, and then it separates out and causes phase separation, deterioration of the fuel. So how is this experiment different than with a fuel tank connected to a small engine? Well, the fuel in the carb evaporates, and the tank continues to make up fuel. Let's assume this lawnmower or some other small engine is sitting in your shed over winter. So the chemicals in the fuel, which readily don't evaporate, tend to become more and more concentrated. And my theory is that given enough time, so far a year does not seem to be enough time to cause solids to start, but I believe that this material becomes the gasoline, and the material that doesn't readily evaporate does become more and more concentrated, and apparently it's corrosive, because I've seen quite a lot of carburetors where I've unfortunately left them set for 18 months or 2 years or something, and they're really a mess. As I look at these fuels, I can't help but wonder, let's say these that have evaporated so much out of them, are they still adequate to run an engine on? And I think I'm going to try a little test on that. Well, I'm sitting beside my little Westinghouse. This is a little 212 cc generator, and this generator is equipped with a T and a line, and this is the main shut-off valve. What I've done is I've shut the fuel off from the tank, and then I went over and opened the drain line. The bowl of the carburetor has a drain in it. Took that drain bolt out, drained the carburetor, and then tried to restart it. And so I know that the carburetor is completely dry. And I have here in my hand, this is the fuel. This was the number 2 jar, if you will, that was treated with StaBil. And this one has evaporated a good part of it. We started out with what was it, 16 ounces of fuel, and it looks like we're well below that now. I'm going to pour this fuel into a measuring cup, kind of check to see how much evaporation has occurred. And then you'll see me attempt to pour the fuel into this auxiliary fuel tank here. And this fuel tank is connected into the T so that it can send fuel into the carburetor, bypassing the fuel tank. So then we'll see how this engine feels about consuming this type of fuel that's a little over a year old and has been kind of condensed as a result of evaporation. Alright, this is almost exactly 8 ounces of fuel, exactly 4 ounces of fuel. So if there was originally 16, it means that 12 ounces of this fuel evaporated over the period when this test was started. This was the little metal plate that came out of the bottom. I'll bring it close. As you can see, it appears to be fairly clean, of a little few dark stains, but obviously no real rusting has occurred during the year's period. Okay, let's see. Choke is on. Oops, got to open the valve here to let the fuel in. Double check to make sure the fuel's not running out of the carburetor. So far, so good. This valve is off. Choke is moved to the on position. Ignition switch is turned on. Let's see if she'll start. Well, this fuel may have not looked very good, but the engine seems to be more than happy to start on it. Okay, now I'm back again, and I've got this time jar number 1, which contained the untreated fuel. And again, this fuel was reduced in volume from 16 ounces to something less. We'll check it here in a moment, due to evaporation. And we'll just repeat this same experiment to see if the engine will start on fuel that's untreated. This fuel does not quite smell like fresh fuel, but it's still like gasoline. I'm optimistic that the engine will start on it, but let's see what happens. Okay, we have, let's just check and see what volume we have. We have about 4 ounces again of gasoline. So since we started out with 16 a year ago, means that we've lost that'd be 12 ounces again due to evaporation. Okay, all the fuel valves to the carburetor to this auxiliary tank are open, and again the original valve to the fuel tank is closed, so we should have filled this carburetor with this Euroed reduced gasoline. Ignition switch is on. Choke is on. Well, it seems that this fuel is, the engine's perfectly satisfied with it. It started quite readily. I was able to move the choke off the choke position immediately, no hesitation of the engine. And as in the last test, I have 2 500-watt lamps here, quartz lamps that I turned on. So I was adding about 1,000 watts of load to this generator, and it had absolutely no problem picking it up. So it seems as though the whole theory that if fuel is over, sometimes what you read in the literature is if fuel is over 4 months old, it's stale and possibly no longer usable. But this would suggest that maybe that's not true. Well, don't believe I've said this before, but today is April the 14th, 2023. So the fuel that you saw in the 5 jars is just a little short of a year ago when this whole process was started. And I guess this is the place in the video where you try to support whatever ridiculous theory that you might be proposing. So here goes. There was no observable benefit that I found to using this StaBil product. It didn't stop evaporation of the gasoline. In fact, if it had stopped the evaporation, it might have made the fuel unusable in a carbureted engine, because the tendency for gasoline to flash into a vapor is important in producing the oxygen fuel mixture that will burn in an engine. When storing by small engines, I have decided that it would be better to forget the fuel stabilizer and instead drain the fuel tank and carburetor. In this experiment, it was noted that the fuel containing ethanol, when stored in a ventilated container, is still viable even after a year of storage. However, 75% of the volume of the fuel was lost due to evaporation. It is my belief that stored fuel will evaporate from the carburetor, and the less volatile chemicals will accumulate in the carburetor bowl, and when the level of these chemicals are high enough, they will promote corrosion. So as a minimum, I recommend that when you store your small engines, at least shut the fuel valve off, and it would be much better to drain both the fuel tank and the carburetor. For those of you who wish to follow up on this issue, I will leave links to Taryl's Fixes All on his website in the attached notes with this video. Well, thanks for watching. I'd be very interested in your comments. And until next time, goodbye.